So welcome back to the third and final video of some of the content that you're going to be getting during the Functional Medicine and Family Tour. This was tough. I had so much more that I wanted to include, different concepts that you may not have heard about, different markers that you may not have heard about, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a taste. The first one we talked about different calculations, and there's a bunch that I'll talk about during the weekend. The second one is about markers. I only use bilirubin, but we're going to be talking about bile acids and neopterin and a whole bunch of markers that you may have heard about and may talk about in a different way than you've heard of. Evidence-based, or some new markers that perhaps you haven't heard about or may not be using but might want to be. Now in this one, we're going to talk about some reference ranges that you may have heard about but need to be using. And specifically, we're going to be talking about this time fasting glucose, which you may think, well, why fasting glucose? The reason why is because there's such disparity as to what a healthy, optimal fasting glucose is. If you look at conventional medicine, it depends on the lab. It might be from 70 to 100, maybe even 70 to 105 or 110, depending on the lab. In the functional blood chemistry world, I don't know if people are teaching it differently, but not very long ago when I learned it, it was 85 to 100 was considered fine. And I will show you that that is completely wrong. And then other groups say that 70 to 75 milligrams per deciliter, this is the US range, of course, is considered optimal. That's a huge disparity. So what do we do? And honestly, I usually go to the scientific literature. So let's take just a look at a few studies that might help us suggest what a better, more optimal range for fasting glucose is going to be. Also, towards the end, I'll be doing a non-fasting glucose using a really cool study. So in this paper here was increased arterial stiffness in healthy subjects with high normal glucose, and I'll show you what that was, in subjects with pre-diabetes. So they said that fasting plasma glucose is an independent positive association to this thing called the brachial ankle pulse wave velocity, which is basically blood flow. The more stiffness there is in an artery, the less blood flow there would be, the higher the brachial ankle pulse wave velocity. And so they showed that an increase in fasting plasma glucose, even within the normal range, and I'll show you what they said that was associated with aggravated arterial stiffness. So here they broke fasting plasma glucose into 4 categories in the quartiles. Between 85 and 83, 84 to 90, 91 to 90, which is considered normal both in conventional medicine and in some functional medicine circles, as well as 100 to 125. Now here's what they found. There was more arterial stiffness in quartile 4 than there was in quartile 2, which makes sense. This glucose is pretty high, but there was more arterial stiffness in quartile 3 than there was in quartile 1. So right there, if this were me, just based on this study, I would not want my fasting glucose to be in the 91 to 99 range, because there was more arterial stiffness than there was in people that had lower fasting glucose levels. So just this study alone, arterial stiffness is probably not a good thing. And if your fasting glucose, according to this paper, was 91 to 99, which according to some people is okay, is absolutely not okay to me. So this was a really cool study. The fasting blood glucose, an underestimated risk factor of cardiovascular death. That's not good. So 22-year study, about 2,000 non-diabetic men. They all had a fasting glucose below 110. After 22 years, 483 men died, 53 from cardiovascular disease. They broke the fasting glucose into quartiles once again, people below 73, 74 to 79, 80 to 85, and then 86 up to 100. So interesting what they found here was that in this group of the highest quartile, 86 to 100, had far more, it was found here, the highest glucose quartile above 85 had a significantly higher mortality rate from cardiovascular disease with those in the lowest quartiles. So this basically says that this group, and while this goes all the way up to 100, it would have been interesting if they broke it down one more time into say like 86 to 91 and what they would have found. But that suggests that possibly in the 90s is not necessarily a good thing. It's not a really great graphic, but in the white is cardiovascular mortality and black is non-cardiovascular. And you can see here that cardiovascular mortality was greatly increased if somebody had a blood glucose above 85 all the way up to 100. Again, I think they probably should have broken that group down one more time. But interestingly, notice that below 73 also had an increased risk of cardiovascular death. So I think when you start to get down into the mid-70s, and that could be a problem potentially as well. Great paper using a large number of people, about 46,000 people from Kaiser Permanente Northwest. They started with people that had a glucose level less than 100 milligrams per deciliter. They broke it into 4 categories: below 85, 85 to 89, 90 to 94, and then 95 to 99, which is, I think, a good breakdown. And here's what they found. Compared with those that had glucose levels lower than 85, 95 to 99 were 233% more likely to develop diabetes, and those that had 90 to 94 were almost 50% more likely to progress to diabetes. So anybody that's saying that a fasting plasma glucose above 90 is okay is wrong. There's an increased risk for diabetes, and it's associated with arterial stiffness. So right now, if we're trying to create an optimal reference range for glucose, I think anything above 90 is absolutely problematic, and therefore the optimal reference range should be less than 90. This was a really great paper, Impaired Fasting Glucose, How Low Should It Go? I won't get into this, but they had a chart in here that I thought was really interesting. So here you have on the y-axis BMI, total cholesterol, triglycerides, systolic blood pressure, and people that were hypertensive. And if you take a real close look at this, there's a point on each of those graphs where the risk, and the x-axis was glucose levels, which you can see down here, the risk of these things went up at the same point in every single one. And that point was right about here, that you notice this point, the same point in every single one of these cases, the risk factor went up. And here you have down in the standard international units, 4.7 millimoles per liter of glucose converts to 85. That's 85 milligrams per deciliter in the US units. So 85 seems to kind of be a sweet spot, especially when you look that as you start to go lower in some of these cases, there's also somewhat of an increased risk. So 85 seems to kind of be a sweet spot. And based on that, and a few more papers that I'm not going into here, it seems that at the bare minimum, a glucose at least of below 90 is considered optimal, no higher than 90. So we cut that down to about 88. In terms of the low end, there may be some wiggle room. You could say about 80, but for a variety of reasons, which I don't have time to go into here, different hormones start to be released as the fasting or the serum glucose level drops much below 80. So in terms of, because of physiology and because of these papers, I am very comfortable with this fasting glucose reference range of about 82 to 88. Now, you could say 80 to 88, that's fine, or you could even say up to 89 or 90, that's fine. But this is a far better optimal reference range than any of the ones that I've personally seen out there. And I have more papers that I'll be covering in the weekend. But while we're on it, how about non-fasting glucose? This was a great paper, Continuous Glucose Profiles in Healthy Subjects Under Everyday Life Conditions. So this was a great paper. I'm going to show you the inclusion criteria because these were really healthy people. When they did the oral glucose tolerance test, they're at 0 minutes. Anybody that in this study had a fasting glucose below 90. Well, I just said that that's optimal. These were healthy people. After 120 minutes of glucose tolerance test, their glucose had to be under 140. If it was above, they weren't included in the study. That's a really great oral glucose tolerance glucose amount. Also, look, their average A1C was only 5.0. When's the last time you've seen that? Their insulin was great. Their C-peptide was incredible. Then they had a few other things here, lipoprotein, cholesterol, creatinine. These were really healthy individuals. And I'm making that point because if we're seeing patients and clients and we're evaluating them, we want to evaluate them against really healthy people. And the people included in this study, based on their inclusion criteria here, were really healthy people. So here's what they did is, I'll show you the meals that they gave, but they gave 4 meals, standardized meals to these people. 2 were high carbohydrate, low protein, low fat, low fiber. Other 2 meals were lower carbohydrate, more protein, more fat, and more fiber. And they looked at their glucose levels. And this all on this text is summarized in the next couple of slides, which I'll show you. So here you have the standardized meals. Meals 1 and 2, you can see there were 75 to 80% carbs, relatively lower protein, relatively lower fat, and not a whole lot of fiber. In meal 3 and 4, notice that the carbohydrate content was only about 27%. Protein was reasonable, quite a bit of fat, and quite a bit of fiber. Now, if you look here, over meal 1 and meal 2, the highest average glucose after that first meal was only about 130. The highest glucose after meal 2 was also only about 130 as well. So this was after in healthy people eating a high carbohydrate meal, and they have the total amount of calories here, a total calorie meal, high carbohydrate, their glucose never went above 130. So if you're evaluating non-fasting glucose, if you have a glucometer in your office and somebody comes in, I don't care if they ate or they didn't eat, that their glucose in this case shouldn't really go much above 130. And then in meal 3 and 4, notice that it's considerably more calories. It was quite a bit more fat. But their glucose, the average glucose after meal 1 or meal 3, I'm sorry, never even broke 100. And then this one here never even broke 120. So based on that, even on a high carbohydrate meal, if somebody just ate, oh, and I should say, another interesting piece of this is the mean time to peak glucose concentration after these meals wasn't even an hour, meaning that they ate any one of those standardized meals. The mean time to the highest glucose concentration was only around 46 to 50 minutes. So if you had someone that come into your office and you run their glucose using a non-fasting glucose using a glucometer, and they said, well, I just ate. According to this study, that shouldn't matter. That their glucose never, go back to this, never got much above 130. And so based on this, based on the glucose of really healthy people after they ate meals, never broke 130, even if it was a high carbohydrate meal, then based on this, I think we can have a pretty solid fasting, non-fasting glucose range that we could use on people. And I'm not getting into it here, but it turns out that fasting glucose, the oral glucose tolerance test or postprandial after eating glucose is a better marker of glucose dysregulation than is fasting glucose. We should be doing non-fasting glucose on people. We should have a glucometer that when they come into the office, we test that. And even if they ate, if it's above 130, then that's indicating, even if they have normal fasting glucose and a normal A1C, the papers are very clear on this, that the response to food in a postprandial fashion, glucose will show dysregulation before, in many cases, an abnormal fasting glucose or A1C. So here's the thing. In this weekend, every reference range that I have is based on at least a couple of studies. So you'll be learning more evidence-based reference ranges during this weekend, and I just gave you an example of this here. So if you are interested in this information, I would really like to see you there. 16 hours, a whole weekend on functional medicine, on blood chemistry interpretation, and as many cool things as I could possibly pack into 16 hours. I sincerely hope I can see you there, and thank you so much for your time.